I can't disclose my true identity. Too many people would recognize me. My face is everywhere, and a single scandal could undo everything I've built. But what happened? I can't keep it bottled up any longer. For now, call me Linda. I'm in the public eye, the kind of person constantly under surveillance. Cameras capture my every move. Tabloids thrive on gossip, and people believe they know me even when they don't. My life is meant to seem flawless, yet one phone call shattered that illusion. It came in the dead of night while I was going over notes for an important event. The number was unlisted. My first impulse was to ignore it, but something urged me to answer. The voice on the other end was calm, assured, and tinged with hostility. I have photos of you, private, intimate ones. My heart stopped. What did he mean? I barely had time to process before he continued. I'm giving you one chance to keep them from going public. 50,000 by Friday, or I'll release them to everyone. I was stunned. My throat constricted and my head spun. How did you know? He interjected sharply. Check your cloud storage. Then the line went dead, leaving me enveloped in a deafening silence. With trembling hands, I checked my phone and scrolled through my cloud storage. There they were, photos taken during private moments, never meant for anyone else. The kind of images that, if leaked, would ruin not only my career but my life. Anxiety gripped me like a vice. Questions swirled in my mind. Who was this man? How did he access my files? What could I do? Calling the police was out of the question. It would only attract more attention and worsen the situation. Confiding in friends or colleagues wasn't an option either. They might judge or even betray me. Then one name surfaced, Connor. Connor is my stepfather, married to my mother for 3 years, though we aren't close. He's a powerful figure, the kind who commands attention the moment he enters a room, wealthy, well-connected, and shrewd. He knows how to get what he wants. We exchanged little more than formal greetings, but I'd seen him handle seemingly impossible situations with ease. If anyone could help me, it was him. Yet, asking him for assistance felt like stepping into a lion's den. It was late, but I knew he'd be in his study. Connor was always busy, always scheming. I lingered outside his heavy wooden door, my hand resting on the polished brass handle. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. He looked up from his desk, his piercing blue eyes meeting mine. Linda, what brings you here at this hour? He asked, leaning back in his chair. I stepped in, my heart racing. I need your help. He raised an eyebrow and gestured for me to sit. The room felt colder as I recounted everything, the photos, the call, the threat. Connor listened without a word, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Do you have any idea who might be behind this? No, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know anyone capable of hacking into my accounts. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. I'll handle it. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. In a low, deliberate tone, he added, You must understand, Linda, nothing comes without a price. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? I asked. Connor's gaze didn't waver. I'll handle the situation, but there will be a cost. Are you willing to accept that? I didn't know how to respond. The desperation in me screamed, Say yes, but a small, cautious voice whispered, At what price? I don't have a choice, I said finally. He smiled faintly, his demeanor as calm as ever. Good. Then leave it to me. But Linda, he leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing, remember that you owe me. I barely slept that night. My thoughts spiraled endlessly. Who was Connor really? What was he capable of? And, most importantly, what had I just agreed to? The next morning, Connor was gone. My mother mentioned he'd gone out early for a business matter. I didn't press her for details. The day dragged on, each hour feeling heavier than the last. Finally, just before dinner, Connor returned. He found me in the living room and gestured for me to follow him to his study. It's done, he said, closing the door behind us. My stomach flipped. What do you mean? I asked, my heart racing. I found the man behind this, he said coolly. And let's just say he won't be bothering you or anyone else again. A chill ran down my spine. What did you do? I asked. Connor's smirk was subtle, but it sent shivers through me. You don't need to know the details. All that matters is that the photos are gone and your reputation is safe. Relief flooded through me, but his next words stopped me cold. This stays between us, Linda. No one can know about it, and don't forget, you owe me. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I should have felt grateful, but instead, I felt trapped. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Connor. "Remember, Linda, trust is everything. Let's talk tomorrow." His words lingered in my mind, heavy with implication. What did he want? What had I gotten myself into? Deep down, I knew one thing: this was only the beginning. And trust me, what happened next was worse than I ever could have imagined. Connor wasted no time. The morning after our conversation, he called me into his study. His expression was calm, but his words sent a shiver down my spine. "I've made progress," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's, a man you likely trusted at some point." My stomach dropped. "Who?" I asked in a barely above a whisper tone. "I'm not ready to give you names just yet," he replied, "but I have a few leads. I'll handle it." I nodded, but my heart raced. How could someone I knew betray me like this? My mind raced through the people in my life, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. None of them seemed capable of something so vile. "Don't look so worried," Connor said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I've dealt with far worse. This will be over soon." But his tone wasn't as comforting as he probably intended. There was something unnerving about his confidence, as though he thrived in situations like these. The next few days were a strange blur. Connor kept me updated with vague statements. "I've narrowed it down," he'd say, or "this won't take long." His calmness unnerved me. I'd catch him watching me from across the room, his gaze steady and unyielding. When I asked questions, he brushed them off with the same cryptic reassurance. During dinner one evening, he said, "When this is over, we'll keep it between us. Some things are better left unsaid." It wasn't a request, it was an order. I nodded, unsure what else to do. By the third day, Connor's mood shifted. He seemed energized, as if he was closing in on something. That evening, as we sat in his study, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and gestured for me to sit across from him. "Linda," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "you've been careful about who you trust, haven't you?" The question felt loaded. "I think so," I replied cautiously. "Good," he said, his gaze piercing. "Because trust is dangerous. It's what gets people into situations like this." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But you can trust me. I'll see this through." I wanted to believe him, but there was something unsettling in the way he said it, as if there was more he wasn't telling me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Connor's words. Who was behind this, and what was he planning? The next morning, he left early again. My mother mentioned that he was handling some urgent matters. I didn't press for details. Around midday, I received a text from Connor. "Making progress. Stay available tonight, we need to talk." The hours dragged. I distracted myself with work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Connor and the mystery of who was behind this nightmare. When Connor returned that evening, his demeanor was different, almost triumphant. He found me in the kitchen and motioned for me to follow him to the study. "It's done," he said, closing the door behind us. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "I found the man behind this," he said, his tone calm but with a hint of satisfaction. Connor hesitated, then added, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that he won't be a problem anymore." My blood ran cold. "What did you do?" I asked again. "You don't need to worry about that," he said, brushing off my question. "The important thing is your photos are gone, and he won't dare come near you again." His words were meant to reassure me, but they did the opposite. "Connor, what did you do to him?" I pressed. He smiled faintly, almost as if amused by my concern. "I handled it. That's all you need to know." I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt trapped, like I had just signed a deal with someone far more dangerous than I realized. Later that night, Connor called me back into his study. He poured another glass of whiskey and sat across from me, the faint glow of his desk lamp casting shadows on his face. "I want you to understand something, Linda," he said in a low, deliberate tone. "This situation could have destroyed you, but I fixed it, and now you owe me." I froze. "What are you talking about?" I asked. His gaze didn't waver. "Nothing in life is free. I went out of my way to clean up your mess, and one day I'll need something from you. When that time comes, I expect you to deliver." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean? What could you possibly want from me?" I asked. Connor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Nothing right now, but remember this moment. When the time comes, I'll remind you." I left the study feeling like I was walking on thin ice. Connor had solved my problem, but his words left a lingering unease. What did he mean by "you owe me," and what price would I have to pay? As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed with a text from Connor. "You did the right thing by trusting me. Let's talk more tomorrow." His message was short but carried weight. Whatever Connor wanted, I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't end here. And the worst part, I wasn't sure I'd be able to say no. A few days later, Connor called me into his study again. His demeanor was calm and composed, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me. "I found him," he said, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Who?" I asked, my stomach twisting in knots. "It was one of your exes," Connor replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "He gained access to your cloud storage, a careless mistake on his part." I felt my heart drop. The idea that someone I once trusted could betray me like this was almost too much to process. "I demand to know," I said, my voice trembling. Connor raised a hand, signaling me to calm down. "That's irrelevant now." "No, it's not," I snapped, stepping closer. "I deserve to know." He tilted his head, watching me with that infuriatingly cool expression. "Linda, what matters is that he won't bother you again." "I made sure of it," he said. I froze. "What did you do?" "I handled it," he said simply. My chest tightened. "What does that mean, Connor? What did you do to him?" He leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink. "I made him understand the consequences of his actions. Let's just say he's very motivated to stay out of your life." The coldness in his tone made my skin crawl. "Did you hurt him?" I asked. Connor's smirk was faint but unmistakable. "I didn't have to. People like him respond well to pressure. He deleted everything, and he won't dare cross you or me again." Relief washed over me, but it was tainted by unease. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only left me with more questions. That evening, as I sat in my room, my mind replayed our conversation. Who was the ex? What kind of pressure had Connor applied? And why was he being so vague about it? My phone buzzed with a text from him. "Problem solved. We'll discuss this further tomorrow. Get some rest." His control over the situation should have made me feel safe, but instead, it felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The next morning, Connor approached me in the kitchen as I poured myself a cup of coffee. "Good morning," he said, his tone unusually cheerful. "Morning," I replied cautiously. He leaned against the counter, studying me. "You seem tense." "You should relax, Linda, the worst is over." I set my cup down, unable to meet his gaze. "Are you sure it's over?" I asked. He nodded completely. "Connor's out of the picture." "But what if?" "Linda," Connor interrupted firmly, "trust me, I've ensured he won't come near you again." The way he said it made it clear he wouldn't entertain further questions. Later that day, Connor called me back to his study. He motioned for me to sit, then took his usual spot behind the massive oak desk. "There's one thing we need to address," he began in a measured tone. "What is it?" I asked, anxiety returning. "You understand that I didn't do this for free," he said, locking eyes with me. "What do you mean?" I asked. Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I took a risk for you, Linda. I used my resources, my connections, my influence, and that doesn't come cheap." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying that you owe me." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Oh, you mean, for what you offered to help me, and I did," he said calmly, "but life doesn't work on charity, Linda. One day I'll need something from you, and when that day comes, I expect you to deliver." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What could you possibly need from me, Connor?" I asked. He shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Nothing yet, but when the time comes, you'll know." For the rest of the day, his words echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just traded one form of blackmail for another. Connor had solved my problem, but at what cost? That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with another message from him. "You can trust me, Linda, we're in this together now." The word "together" made my skin crawl. What had I gotten myself into? The following days were eerily calm. Connor acted as though nothing had happened, going about his routine with his usual composure. Yet every now and then, I'd catch him watching me, his gaze lingering just a little too long. One evening during dinner, he said something that made my heart skip a beat. "You know, Linda, you're lucky to have someone like me looking out for you," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intense. I forced a smile. "I appreciate everything you've done," I replied cautiously. He nodded, a satisfied expression on his face. "Good, because I've done more for you than you realize." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I tried to return to my normal routine, but Connor's presence loomed over me like a shadow. Every interaction with him felt charged, as if there were a subtext I couldn't quite grasp. Then, one night, he dropped the pretense entirely. "Linda, you've been distant lately. Is something bothering you?" he asked as we sat in the living room, the house quiet around us. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "No, I'm just processing everything." He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto mine. "You can talk to me. You know we're closer now than we've ever been. You can trust me." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened my unease. I managed a weak smile and excused myself, retreating to my room. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Connor's involvement in my life was far from over, and deep down, I knew the real price of his help was yet to be revealed. After the crisis with the blackmailer ended, Connor's demeanor toward me began to change. At first, it was subtle, a lingering glance here, a pointed comment there, but as days turned into weeks, his tone became more deliberate, his words more unsettling. One evening, as we sat in the dimly lit living room, he broke the silence. "I've done more for you than anyone else ever would," he said, his voice calm but heavy with implication. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my piercing gaze meeting his. "I want you to understand, Linda, that what I did for you wasn't just a favor, it was a sacrifice. And sacrifices demand something in return." The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating. "I'm grateful, Connor," I stammered, unsure where this was going. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Gratitude is nice, but it's not enough." The days that followed were filled with tension. Connor made a point of reminding me of what he'd done for me, often in ways that felt like veiled threats. "You know," he said one morning over coffee, "it's funny how people forget who's really there for them when it matters most." "I haven't forgotten," I replied cautiously. "Good," he said sharply, "because I'd hate to think you were taking me for granted." His words lingered long after he left the room. One night, Connor cornered me in the hallway. The house was quiet. My mother was out of town again. He stepped closer than I was comfortable with, his presence dominating the narrow space. "You've been avoiding me," he said in a slow, steady voice. "I haven't," I lied, my heart racing. "Yes, you have," he said, his tone almost amused. "But you can't avoid this forever." I tried to step back, but he moved with me, keeping an uncomfortably close distance. "We have an understanding, Linda," he continued. "Don't we?" I whispered, my voice trembling. His smirk returned, more pronounced this time. "Come on, don't play dumb, you know exactly what I mean." Later that night, I sat alone in my room, replaying the interaction over and over, his words, his tone, his proximity. It all felt wrong, but what could I do? He was the one who had saved me. He was the one who knew my darkest secret. I thought about telling my mother, but the idea felt impossible. How could I explain any of this without unraveling everything? Then a message from Connor appeared on my phone. "We need to talk. Don't make me come to you." My stomach tightened. I considered ignoring it, but I knew that would only make things worse. The next day, Connor found me in the kitchen. His mood seemed lighter, almost casual, but his words were anything but. "I've been patient, Linda," he said, pouring himself a glass of water, "but patience isn't infinite." "What do you owe me?" I asked, my voice cracking. He set the glass down and turned to face me fully. "I think you already know." I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "No, I don't." "Just say it." He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "I want you to acknowledge what we have, the bond we've built through this ordeal. You and I, Linda, are closer than anyone else. Don't deny it." My breath caught in my throat. "Connor, this isn't right, you're my stepfather," I protested. He laughed softly, the sound sending chills down my spine. "That's just a word. We adults, Linda, understand each other in ways no one else does." From that moment, everything shifted. Connor's intentions were no longer veiled. He began pushing boundaries in ways that left no room for doubt. "You owe me," he said one evening as we sat in the living room, "and it's time to start paying." I tried to reason with him. "Connor, you're making this into something it's not. I'm grateful for what you did, But gratitude isn't enough. He interrupted sharply. I took a risk for you, Linda. I put myself on the line, and now you want to act like that means nothing. That's not what I'm saying, I said quickly, desperate to de-escalate. Then what are you saying? He demanded, leaning forward, his eyes burning into mine. Because all I hear is you trying to wiggle out of your responsibility. The next few days were a nightmare. Connor's presence became inescapable. His demands grew more insistent. Every time we were alone, he found a way to remind me that I was in his debt. I made you a promise, he said one night as I tried to retreat to my room. I'd protect you no matter what. But promises go both ways. What do you want from me, Connor? I finally snapped, tears streaming down my face. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. You'll see soon enough. I felt like I was suffocating. Connor had me cornered, and I didn't know how to get out. Every attempt to distance myself only seemed to make him push harder. One evening, he sat me down in his study, closing the door behind him. This has gone on long enough, Linda, he said in a calm but final tone. You need to decide, are you with me, or are you against me? What does that even mean? I asked, my voice shaking. It means, he replied, leaning forward, that you can either embrace what we have or walk away and deal with the consequences. Consequences? I repeated, my chest tightening. Connor's smirk returned. Do you really think I'd let you walk away without paying your debt? That night, I knew I had to act. Connor had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But what could I do? He held all the power, and I had no one to turn to. The only thing I was sure of was this. Whatever Connor's next move was, it would change everything. Connor's persistence reached its peak that night. The house was eerily quiet. My mother was still away on one of her endless work trips. I was sitting in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, when he appeared. We need to talk, he said in a low, commanding voice. I don't think we do, I replied, not looking up. Linda, he said, stepping closer, stop pretending we're past all that now. I put the book down, my hands trembling. For what, Connor? You've been twisting this into something it's not. He smirked, leaning down until our eyes met. You can lie to yourself, but you can't lie to me. We can be honest with each other now. You feel it too, don't you? My heart raced, a mix of fear and fury surging through me. You're delusional, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, but Connor wasn't deterred. He sat on the edge of the coffee table, his tone softening. Why fight it? We've been through so much together, you and I, Linda. We understand each other in ways no one else ever could. Just as he reached for my hand, the front door opened. I froze. Relief flooded me as my mother stepped inside, but that relief turned to dread when I saw her face. She wasn't just back early, she had heard everything. Her eyes locked on Connor, blazing with fury. She held up her phone, the screen still lit. I heard it all, she said, her voice cold and steady. Connor shot to his feet, his calm facade cracking. Linda, this isn't what it looks like. Don't, she interrupted sharply. Don't you dare insult me by pretending I've known for weeks that something was off, Connor. And now I know exactly what it is. I sat there, stunned, as my mother stepped closer, her presence commanding. You thought I wouldn't notice? You thought you could manipulate me and get away with it, she continued, her voice rising. You've underestimated me, Connor, and that was your biggest mistake. Connor tried to regain control, his tone shifting to one of placation. Linda, I can explain, this is a misunderstanding. No, Connor, she said, raising a hand to silence him. There's nothing to explain. You took advantage of a vulnerable situation. You tried to use my daughter, and for that, you're done. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, but my mother wasn't finished. If you try anything at all, I'll make sure you regret it, she said, her voice icy. You know what I'm capable of, Connor. Don't test me. For the first time since I'd known him, Connor looked genuinely defeated. He glanced at me, then back at her, before grabbing his coat without another word and walking out the door. The moment he was gone, I broke down, the weight of everything crashing over me. My mother wrapped her arms around me, holding me tightly. You'll never face this alone again, she said softly. I'll make sure of it. That night changed everything. Connor disappeared from our lives completely. My mother and I worked together to rebuild the trust and safety he had tried to destroy, and as for me, I learned that strength doesn't come from facing things alone. It comes from the people who stand by you, no matter what.